friends, and welcome back once again to an episode of The Bible Yogi. I am your host, Douglas Roberts, and today we're covering the last few chapters of the book of Exodus. This is 22 or so, and we've come into a very, very serious topic, the capital punishments and other laws that are outlined in the book of Exodus. Before I do, it was dawning on me at the last episode that I was a little bit stuck on a thought that was in my mind about trying to describe what the word grace means to me. And finally, it dawned on me it's my wife. She personifies the word grace. She is a professional therapist, and she's got an immense amount of empathy and sympathy and people, and she's very successful at what she does. And from me on the outside, I look at it and I hear her stories, and what happens is people go to her and they just feel like they can tell her anything and they can divulge anything and everything. And she's heard some horrible stories and and people always tend to say to her, I've never told this to anyone. And through that confession, or through that just people being able to discuss the horrific details of their childhood and that kind of thing, they end up getting healed. And so that phenomenon, her ability to be able to talk with people and have them feel perfectly safe, and they can divulge anything to her and it's perfectly okay. So that's what I think of with the word of grace. So now we're talking about capital punishment. And the Bible, in the book of Exodus, it begins to outline some of the crimes that it wants to say are punishable by death. And I'm really not here to try to second guess God. That's just what the Bible says. There's no nuance or interpretation of it. I will try to give you some perspective on it all, why it should work in ancient Israel, why it may not be working so great today in our society, that kind of thing. But there's an interesting point in history back in the 1870s where we had expanded as a country into the western Arkansas and the Indian Territory. On the very edge of that territory was a place called Fort Smith. And what had happened was there was a judge there by the name of Story. Story was his last name, Judge Story. And he was corrupt. And so crime would occur, people would get murdered, people would get kidnapped, and other horrible crimes. And a lot of criminals were taking advantage of the Indians, who were trying to just deal with the fact that that Americans were expanding westward and continued to kind of push the Indians further west. And there were criminals that were taking advantage of Indians and stealing from them, and it was just a bad situation. And it was essentially a lawless place. So Ulysses S. Grant decided to appoint a man by the name of Isaac C. Parker, who was a staunch Christian Methodist, to be the sole judge over this western Arkansas and Indian Territory. And he had no compunction about his role. He executed the law without prejudice. He could not be bribed. He could not be bargained with. And when he felt that his deputies had captured the right man and murderer or whoever he was, he tended to lead the juries just a little bit and get them to pass on a conviction, a guilty conviction. He ended up hanging around 85 men over his 20-year career. He handed out something like 250 death penalties, and a lot of these were commuted by the Supreme Court to be lifelong sentences. But the reason why I'm telling this story is because his presence there actually turned around that part of the country. And it went from being one of the, the Wild West, where people were gunfights in the streets and all this kind of crazy stuff going on, to a place where there was peace and there was justice. And the people who lived through it, they attested to that fact. That it changed. He changed his little part of the world, and this, to me, this proved that justice and even the death penalty, when it is swift and sure, it tends to have the desired effect. Criminals definitely think twice before they go off on a killing spree in this kind of a territory. So this went on for about 20 years, and the ending of the story was really bizarre. Sometime into this, I would imagine about 15 years into his judgeship, there was a snazzy lawyer by the name of J. Warren Reed. And this guy was very intelligent and very crafty. And he would get the jury members to kind of doubt what they're hearing, and he could get hung juries and undecided juries really well. And he would always try to appeal whenever a decision didn't go his way. And in short, he became one of the staunchest fighters for these criminals. And he was very successful at it. And in him being successful, he was, of course, ruining the success that the judge, Parker, was having with cleaning up this part of the world. So they were, definitely at loggerheads with each other. And this guy became rich. He was very wealthy. He had, I think they said he had like a velvet hat, this purple velvet hat, and, velvet purple, coat jacket. And he was very rich looking. Everybody knew who he was. And then all of a sudden, 1889, Congress passed the automatic appeals law for death penalty convictions. So suddenly J. Warren Reed was not needed anymore, because even a criminal, no matter what, his court case was going to get appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. It's going to take years and years and years, and they were very, very likely, from what I understood reading the book, the percentage was something like 19 out of 20 times, they were going to commute your death penalty sentence to life imprisonment. So suddenly there was no market for J. Warren Reed. So at the end of his life, the man was destitute and a drunk and seen wandering the streets of Fort Smith in the same old tattered velvet outfit. So that was very sad. But just as sad was, as that man and then this appeals law effectively destroyed the peace and tranquility and the justice that Judge Parker had brought about in his 20 years of service. When he retired, he died of a broken heart within, I think it was 3 months after he retired. So that was very sad. And it was interesting how the government just didn't care that the populace was effectively safer. They didn't care that crime was going way down. They just had this weird fear of putting people to death, which we'll discuss, the psychology of that as we go. But there was one interesting fact about the Indians that was in this book I read. Oh, where's my book? Let me find it real quick. Yeah, here it is. He Hanged 'Em High by Homer Croy. And that was the story of Isaac Parker. But the fun fact about the Indians was that Judge Parker had a crew of deputies and marshals that about 80 strong that would go out and they would hunt all these murderers and thieves, horse thieves and whatnot. And when it was discovered that an Indian was the criminal, they'd hunt him down, they'd find him, and they'd say, "You're under arrest." Right here they are, they're 50 miles away from Fort Smith or whatever. And the Indian would say, "Okay, you got me. In 3 days, I'll show up at Fort Smith." And the deputies would be, "Okay, see you there." And they'd turn around and leave and let the guy go free. And it was said that an Indian never failed to make his court appearance, even when he knew he was facing the death penalty. For these guys, or for that culture, their word was their bond. If they said, "You got me, I'll be there," they were. And I thought that was fascinating, and the author here thought that was fascinating too. So, a couple other thoughts before we embark on understanding the capital punishments as outlined in the Bible. We need to remember that the Old Testament was constructing a system of law that was designed for the nation of Israel, in large part, that had to remain intact so that the lineage of Christ could be achieved, and that the promise to Abraham was in safe hands. It was in a safe, country. But you'll see as we go through all the old histories and all the old prophets of the Bible that, man, the Jews, they couldn't get it right for more than one or two generations in succession before they fell back into idol worship and all that. And then God would judge them and bring an army in to crush them and all this and drag them into slavery. And then a king would arise and he would worship the Lord, and they'd all come back to Jerusalem. So there was this constant push and pull going on. So let's just review what God had stated were crimes worth capital punishment. And the first one, which is kind of obvious and fair, he that smiteth a man so that he die shall surely be put to death. So in other words, if you get caught murdering somebody, the penalty is death. And if a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, then I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. What does this mean? This means that the man, if I don't have an intention, this is like third degree murder. First degree is where you plot it out, where you've, practically announced to the world, I'm going to go kill that guy, then you go do it, Third degree is I'm not lying in wait. I'm not waiting for my opportunity. This just kind of happened that I accidentally killed him or whatever. Then God is appointing the place where you can go flee. And this ended up being the horns of the altar in the holiest of holies of the tabernacle or of the temple. And then at that point, the priests, spot him there. There's a man clinging to the altar here, seeking refuge or amnesty from a murder he committed. So now we will pray to God about this, and we will bring the elders forth, and we will decide what to do about this. And so they would pray and offer up sacrifices and figure it out. And if they determined that the man was guilty, they would kill him anyway. But that was a way for an accidental death, or someone who is guilty of an accidental death, manslaughter, could find sanctuary in the sanctuary. And there it says, but if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him even from mine altar that he may die. So yeah, there you couldn't just, kill someone and then go run to the altar and say it was an accident. They'd figure it out. And now here's an interesting one. He that smiteth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Now, you think about this. This just means I slap my dad or I slap my mom, and now the community is going to put me to death, surely. Now, you might say that this is a little bit extreme, but let's think about it a little bit. This reminds one of the broken window theory of crime prevention that was in fact instantiated by Rudy Giuliani in New York City some generations ago. But when he did that, it brought down the murder rate by like 80%. Some crazy, great statistic, you can look it up. But the broken window theory worked like this. I was like, where there's a broken window, it attracts crime. It attracts bad things to happen, just like loose trash, It attracts worse things to happen. But the way this was implemented was they began with simple token jumpers in the subway. They said, we're not going to allow token jumpers in the subway. And whenever someone did jump the token turnstile, the cops would jump on him and they'd grab him and they'd run his ID and they'd look out for any outstanding warrants, and they'd check him for weapons, they'd check him for drugs on him, and lo and behold, they kept on finding guys that had outstanding warrants for burglary, for murders, for other crimes, and they would arrest them and throw them in jail. So pretty soon, go figure, a criminal who's willing to mug somebody is also going to jump the turnstile. Ta-da! And so they would grab these guys jumping turnstiles, seems like nothing, but lo and behold, they nab serious criminals. And it did decrease crime, and that's why things like jumping turnstiles is, in fact, a serious offense. I think the same thing happens here. If you smite your father, that represents such a reprehensible, depraved state of mind that God is saying, nope, you've turned the corner. You're no good. You're probably doing all kinds of horrible, worse things than this, or you're going to. This we will not allow. You get put to death. And that's my take on that. The other one is, and he that stealeth a man and selleth him, he shall be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. This is about kidnapping. Oh, and speaking as a father, we do get old, we do get frail. And if our kids start to beat us up, boy, did we ever screw up badly, didn't we? So also they can kill us pretty easily, they've got 30 years on them, you know what I mean? So once they get big enough to beat us up, it's pretty much all over for us. We can't defend ourselves against stuff like that. So it is a terrible offense. And now, check this out. He that curseth his father or mother shall surely be put to death. So you can't even yell at him, So all fathers and mothers out there, I'm sure they're down with this. We don't want to see our kids killed for something like that. But then again, we don't want to be cursed either, right? But this keeps the generational wisdom, the line of generational wisdom should remain unbroken. I could go on for hours about this, but this is kind of like, I'll give an example. In Japan, they are notoriously good at raising well-behaved, calm children. And this is largely because they've passed down and refined these disciplinary techniques they use on children, such as, just calming techniques they use. That it's been passed down for ages. You can't figure out that kind of stuff on your own from scratch, because it's extremely hard to be so disciplined and self-composed yourself when you haven't been brought up in that kind of a value system that values calmness and peacemaking above all things. Societal cohesion is valued extremely highly in Japan, and they do this through calmness, through quiet interactions, through focused attention and focused listening and stuff like that. Anyway, there's a lot to it. I highly recommend checking that out. And that's why you shouldn't curse your parents. You got to keep that line of that. The whole reason why I was telling you that is because of the line of continuity. It would be almost impossible to figure out those concepts on your own as a parent, as some dumb 19-year-old like me, suddenly being a dad and raising kids. We were ad-libbing. All we knew was that our parents screwed up, so maybe we can correct what they did, right? And I'm sure mine feel the exact same way. Boy, did dad screw up. I can't wait to do everything to my kids exactly the opposite of this knucklehead, So that's why it's good to not curse your parents, to try to learn what you can from them, take the good, and keep refining the way we raise the next generation. Okay. Now this is a very interesting one. We're talking about ox goring, and we're also talking about capital punishments. So here is the verse. We'll read it. If the ox were wont to push with his horn in time past. This means if the ox were so inclined to try to gore people in the past, and we knew all about it, And it hath been testified to its owner. We've told the owner about your stupid goring ox you have, and he hath not kept him in. He hath not controlled this beast. And then the ox hath killed a man or a woman. The ox shall be stoned, and his owner shall also be put to death. Now, that's a problem, but God spent an awful lot of time talking about ox goring, and I'm like, why? Why was this that big of a problem? But the way I look at it is that this is probably one of the very few ways you could get accidentally killed out in a, agrarian society. I mean, the most dangerous weapon was like a plow. People weren't going out with guns where a gun could just go off accidentally and kill someone. There was very little opportunity for something like that. For here, now in today's society, we have car accidents. We have all kinds of huge, heavy equipment and, lawnmowers, snow blowers, things that can chop off your hands and that kind of things, but especially cars. You can easily be killed by a car. And so the way I look at this is like one of those circumstances where it's an accidental death, and yet we could have foreseen this problem. And this is the principle I take away from this. If you're a bad driver, a drunk driver, and you kill someone, maybe we let you go and, don't execute you after the first time, but after the second time, then, you already knew that behavior was going to kill people and you already did it. So perhaps we should look to the death penalty for things like that also, even if the second time it's an accidental death. Okay, now this is part 2. That first part, I tried to focus on, just things that seemed serious enough, the kidnapping and the murder and the accidental deaths that could have been prevented if you had a lick of common sense. So now let's get to some other ones that just caught my eye, and I'm trying to be exhaustive in this, but there's a lot of these rules that you could break that would result in capital punishment. This is from Exodus 22, and I'll just encourage you to go read it and see if you think they are fair or not. I think for the most part they are. I mean, I'm not going to second guess God too much, but this one's interesting. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. So you can be a witch and you get the death penalty. I'm sure I hear some people out there complaining about that, but see, this would mean that you are praying or summoning demons. Why would you do that in a nation that already has the ear of God himself on your side? You got to seek the good God, not some demons, right? So yeah, that was tantamount to Satan worship, and they did not brook it. Whosoever lieth with a beast shall surely be put to death. Okay? And bestiality was certainly frowned upon. He that sacrificeth unto any god except the Lord only, he shall be utterly destroyed. In the Old Testament, there's these couple of gods, one's named Baal and another named Moloch, and they were known to be what we would call fertility cults. Essentially, they're people that are worshiping deities or demons that are essentially lust demons, where you have things like orgies and stuff. And what ends up happening is women eventually they get pregnant and they don't want those babies. So what do? They abort them or they kill them after they are born, after the fact. And so those other gods were loathsome, especially to God, who's trying to have a pure society, a righteous society. So sacrifice unto any other god, you shall be utterly destroyed. Some courtesy. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. That's a good one to know. That's a law of the land of Egypt, or in Israel. You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If you afflict them in any way, and they cry at all unto me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword. And your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. So here, God's not even saying, you guys police yourselves. He's saying, I'll step in. This is the kind of thing that's done in secret with a very vulnerable victim who perhaps doesn't have the strength, wit, or occasion to defend themselves or to get justice for themselves. So God himself says, I will stand up for them. no problem. And then there's a bunch of others. If thou shalt lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer, someone who loans with interest, a loan shark, if you will. Neither shall thou lay upon him interest, usury. And if thou takest thy neighbor's raiment to pledge, meaning their coat, right? Because their coat was one of the more expensive things. If you're 2 steps away from being homeless, right, the last thing you have is your coat or your cloak. So you're trying to borrow money to survive. So I've taken your coat as a pledge, and I've given you money, and now you're going to return that money, and I'm taking your coat as a pledge. Then nevertheless, I give it back to him when the sun goes down. For that is his covering only, and his covering for his skin. Wherein shall he sleep? And it shall come to pass when he crieth unto thee that I will hear, for I am gracious. So isn't that's interesting? This guy owes you money, and he's given you collateral, and God's saying, give the collateral back to him at night. And this is what's called a high trust society, right? And that's what God was trying to implement, a place where everybody felt safe. Those widows, the stranger, they were all supposed to be treated right. For thou shalt not revile the gods, nor curse the ruler of thy people. And I think that's a good one. For those of you out there who don't like whoever our current president is and rail against him, I encourage you to, if we're going to criticize our leaders, we should do it with a tone of respect, no matter who they are. We may disagree with them, but we need to not revile them, because God is not pleased with us, especially us little peons like me, criticizing those who have, climbed the mountain of, government and then tried to serve us for good or ill. But we don't curse the ruler of our people. You shall not delay to offer the first of thy ripe fruits and thy liquors. This is your sacrifice to God. The firstborn of thy son shalt thou give unto me. Right? So previously it was said that the first who opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. So we dedicate the firstborn of our children and of our flocks to the Lord. And if it's a flock, like a goat or a ram or something, cow, then we sacrifice it to the Lord. But if it's our son, then we just commend him to the Lord. And then there it is. Likewise, thou shalt do with thine oxen and thy sheep. 7 days it shall be with his mom. And on the 8th day thou shalt sacrifice it to the Lord. And you shall be holy men unto me. And neither shall thou eat any flesh that is torn of beasts in the field. You shall cast it to the dogs. And I could go on and on and on about these laws, but they're pretty straightforward. I think that they do. God ends up describing all kinds of nuances with theft and with what we're looking at the screen here, Exodus 22 and 24. It takes a little bit of parsing, but if a man shall steal an ox or a sheep and kill it or sell it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 for a sheep. Then 3 scriptures later it says, if the theft be certainly found in his hand alive, that whether it be an ox or an ass or a sheep, then he shall restore double. So isn't that curious? If you kill it or sell it, then you owe the guy 5, 5 for an ox, 4 for a sheep. But if they catch you with it and it's still alive, then you just have to pay back double. So interesting little subtle nuances, but I've said before, I love this kind of stuff, because in our society, if something gets stolen from us, they could drive our car off a cliff and we're just out of car. There's no law that says that the person who stole it and wrecked it has to give us 2 cars back, right? That would be nice. But I encourage you guys to go out and read those scriptures in the book of Exodus. That's the most concise place. The book of Leviticus goes into all kinds of stuff, including cleansing of pots and clothes, and the cleansing of diseases like leprosy. So that material can get kind of dry, but it is very straightforward and easy to comprehend. Sometimes in a situation like what I've just shown you, it takes a couple of readings to figure out exactly what God's going for there, as far as like fairness or the principle that he's trying to apply. But I found them to be very interesting, like that one. To kill the ox, you own 5, but if it's still alive, you only own 2. All right. Anyway, with that, folks, thanks for stopping by. And till next time, everybody, please take care.